The name Alexander Royce commanded respect across continents. A billionaire whose empire stretched from technology to real estate, he was known as a man who never lost. Yet for all his wealth and power, Alexander found himself facing an enemy he could not conquer, his own failing body. It began innocently enough, a fatigue he brushed off as overwork, then came the relentless tremors in his hands and the dizzy spells that left him unable to stand. Soon, his mansion was transformed into something resembling a private hospital, with 20 of the world's most accomplished doctors flown in on private jets. Specialists from London, surgeons from New York, herbalists from India, even experimental researchers from Germany, each entered his grand estate with confidence, only to leave days later with their heads bowed, admitting defeat. The atmosphere inside the mansion grew heavier with every passing hour. Once filled with the sound of meetings and lavish parties, the halls now echoed with hushed voices and worried footsteps. The staff, once proud to serve the most powerful man in the city, whispered in fear as they carried trays of untouched food and removed unopened medicine bottles. They had never seen their master like this. Alexander, a man who once strode through rooms commanding attention, now lay motionless in his oversized bed, his pale face betraying the fragility he had always hidden from the world. Despite the constant bustle of doctors and nurses, one figure moved quietly in the background, Elena, a maid who had served the Royce household for nearly a decade. She dusted the curtains, adjusted pillows, and cleared the untouched meals, her eyes lingering on Alexander with a silent sorrow she could not voice. Unlike the others, she had seen a glimpse of his heart years ago, when he secretly paid for her son's surgery without expecting thanks. That single act had etched a debt of gratitude in her soul, and now, as she watched him suffer while the best medical minds failed, Elena felt an ache that words could not capture. Each night, after the last doctor left shaking his head, Elena stood outside his door, her hands clenched, fighting the urge to step inside and do what no one else dared. For hidden deep within her was a secret, a gift passed down from her grandmother, a healer in her village. She had long buried that past, afraid the modern world would call it superstition. But as Alexander's condition worsened, the quiet maid began to wonder if perhaps fate had placed her here for this very moment. Elena lay awake that night in her small, modest room tucked away at the far end of the mansion. Sleep refused to come as she replayed the haunting image of Alexander's weakened body, his once commanding presence now reduced to frailty. She thought of the parade of doctors who had come and gone, their confident promises dissolving into frustration. She thought of the hushed conversations among the staff, some already whispering about what would happen to them if their master did not survive. But what kept her heart restless was not fear of losing her job, it was the gnawing certainty that she possessed knowledge that could save him. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, as clear as if the old woman were sitting beside her, the hands that serve with love can also heal with power. Elena had grown up in a remote village where her grandmother was the only healer people trusted. She remembered long nights watching her prepare poultices from herbs, murmuring chants passed down through generations, and laying gentle hands upon the sick. Elena herself had learned those remedies, practicing them in secret, but when she moved to the city, she buried that life away. People here scoffed at village traditions, calling them old wives' tales. She never spoke of it, not to her employers, not even to her own son. But now, as Alexander's life seemed to slip through every doctor's fingers, Elena realized that silence might cost him everything. With trembling resolve, she rose from her bed and opened a small wooden box she had carried with her for years. Inside were dried herbs, carefully preserved and hidden away, a reminder of the life she had once left behind. She clutched them tightly, whispering a prayer for courage. That night, after the last of the nurses retired and the mansion lay quiet, Elena slipped into Alexander's room. He lay still, his breathing shallow, his skin cold to the touch. Sitting beside him, she placed her hands gently on his chest and began to chant softly in the dialect of her childhood, words she had not spoken aloud in years. Then, with practiced care, she brewed a simple tea from her herbs, lifting his head to let him sip. To her astonishment, the change was almost immediate. His breathing steadied, the violent trembling slowed, and for the first time in weeks, a faint flush of color returned to his cheeks. Elena's heart pounded as tears welled in her eyes. She had taken a risk, and something within her whispered that this was only the beginning. The next morning, the entire mansion buzzed with disbelief. Servants who entered Alexander's room expecting to find the same pale, fragile man nearly dropped their trays when they saw him sitting upright in bed, spooning broth into his mouth with steady hands. His voice, though raspy, carried a strength none of them had heard in weeks. "I'm hungry," he had told Elena with a faint smile, as though mocking the illness that had once stolen his appetite. Word traveled quickly down the marble halls, "Mr. Royce is recovering." By the time the first doctors arrived, summoned by urgent calls from the staff, the atmosphere had already shifted from despair to astonishment. The team of 20 medical experts stood around Alexander's bed, their brows furrowed, scanning charts, checking his vitals, and asking questions he could finally answer with clarity. They were baffled. His fever had broken, his pulse was steady, and his body showed no signs of the rapid decline that had confounded them for weeks. "This is impossible," one whispered, while another muttered, "We did nothing new, how could he have improved overnight?" They pressed Elena, the only person who had been in the room through the night, but she bowed her head and offered no explanation. Yet whispers spread like wildfire among the mansion staff. Servants who had seen Elena carry her small wooden box began to murmur. One gardener swore he heard chanting from the master's room long after the doctors had gone. By noon, the rumor had taken full shape, the maid healed him. Some dismissed it as foolish gossip, but others, remembering the look of peace on Elena's face that morning, believed it wholeheartedly. When Alexander called for her privately, Elena's heart nearly stopped. She entered his room, her hands trembling, expecting accusations or even dismissal. Instead, she found him gazing at her with eyes that seemed sharper, alive with curiosity. "Elena," he said, his voice low but steady, "they tell me I am a miracle. Miracles do not happen without a reason. Tell me the truth, what did you do?" For a long moment she hesitated, torn between fear of ridicule and the pull of honesty. Finally, she lowered her gaze and whispered the words she had kept hidden for years, "I only did what my grandmother once taught me. I only tried to help you." To her surprise, Alexander did not laugh or dismiss her. Instead, a weak chuckle escaped his lips. "Then, Elena," he said, gripping her hand with surprising strength, "you may have just saved my life when all the world's doctors could not." Over the following weeks, Alexander's recovery astonished everyone who witnessed it. Each day he grew stronger, his step steadier, his voice clearer, and his laughter, once thought gone forever, returned to echo through the mansion halls. The doctors, baffled and bruised in pride, reluctantly admitted they had no explanation for his sudden turn toward health. Some clung to theories of coincidence, others insisted his body had simply fought back, but none dared challenge the evidence before them. The billionaire who had been at death's door was now walking the grounds of his estate, arm in arm with the maid who had stood by him when the world's greatest minds had failed. For Elena, life changed overnight. Once invisible in her simple uniform, she was now the subject of stares, whispers, and even envy among the staff. Yet she remained humble, never boasting of what she had done. She tended to Alexander with quiet devotion, never seeking reward. But Alexander was not a man who forgot a debt, especially one that had saved his very life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold, he invited her into his private study. The room was lined with books and filled with memories of victories past, yet he looked at her with a vulnerability that wealth could not disguise. "Elena," he began softly, "I built an empire believing that money could buy anything, power, respect, even health. But when it mattered most, all my wealth was useless. You, someone the world would overlook, saved me with nothing but your hands, your heart, and your faith. How can I ever repay that?" Tears filled Elena's eyes, and she shook her head. "Sir, I need no repayment. You once saved my son when I had nothing. What I did was only to return what you gave me, a chance at life. But Alexander would not accept silence as her reward. Days later, he made a public announcement that stunned the business world. He created a new foundation dedicated to supporting natural healers, traditional medicine, and forgotten practices from small villages like Elena's. And at the head of it, he placed her, not as a maid, but as the director, his trusted partner in this mission. From that day forward, Alexander Royce never introduced her as, my maid. He introduced her as, the woman who saved me when 20 doctors could not. And in every gathering, when asked how he had survived, he would smile and reply, because sometimes, angels wear the most ordinary disguises.